Picture this. It is the year 1066. The Norman fleet has just landed on the southern coast of England, bringing with it the man who will reshape history, William the Conqueror. But before William can march to Hastings, before he can slaughter the Anglo-Saxons and claim the crown, he has a terrifying, superstitious task to complete. According to a rare fragment of the Icelandic sagas, William does not fear the living English armies half as much as he fears a dead man. He orders his soldiers to locate a specific unmarked burial mound overlooking the sea. He forces them to dig, to break open the earth until they find the decaying remains of a Viking warlord who died nearly 2 centuries prior. William orders the corpse to be dragged out and burned to ash on a massive pyre. Why? Because legend held that as long as those specific bones remained in the ground, no invader could ever successfully conquer England. The bones belonged to a man so terrifying that even his corpse was a weapon of mass destruction. This is not just a legend of superstition, it is a testament to the true story of Ivar the Boneless. Before diving into these forgotten stories of survival and suffering, if you enjoy learning about the hidden truths of history, consider hitting that like button and subscribing for more content like this. And please comment below to let me know where you're listening from. I find it incredible that we're exploring these ancient stories together from different parts of the world, connected across time and space by our shared curiosity about the past. Now, let's strip away the myth and look at the blood. To understand the monster who scared William the Conqueror 200 years after his death, we have to travel back to a wedding night in the early 9th century. A night that was supposed to be filled with passion, but was instead marked by a dark prophecy. The parents are legends themselves, the ambitious Viking hero Ragnar Lothbrok and the mystic seeress Aslaug. The sagas tell us that Aslaug warned her new husband. She told him that if they consummated their marriage too soon, if they did not wait 3 holy nights, the child conceived would be cursed. She warned that the boy would be born without the structural integrity of a human being. Ragnar, driven by lust and arrogance, ignored her. He forced himself upon her, and 9 months later the prophecy screamed its way into the world. The child was named Ivar. But as the midwives examined him, they recoiled. His legs were twisted. Where there should have been sturdy bone, there was only soft gristle and cartilage. In the brutal society of the Norsemen, where physical strength was not just a virtue but a requirement for life, this baby should have been taken out to the forest and left for the wolves. It was the custom. It was mercy. A Viking who could not walk could not fight. A Viking who could not fight was useless. But Ivar was not killed. Against all logic, against all tradition, he was kept alive. Why? This is the first great mystery of his life. Perhaps his eyes held a terrifying intelligence that stayed his father's hand. Or perhaps his survival was the first sign of his unparalleled cruelty, a refusal to die simply to spite the world that didn't want him. Modern medicine offers us a name for his condition today: Osteogenesis Imperfecta, or brittle bone disease. It is a genetic mutation that leaves the skeleton fragile, the whites of the eyes tinted blue, and the body in constant agonizing pain. Imagine growing up in a culture that worships Thor's hammer and the warrior's axe, while your own body breaks under the weight of a blanket. Every movement is a risk of fracture. Every play fight with your brothers is a potential death sentence. Yet Ivar did not just survive, he thrived. He realized very early on that if he could not be the strongest man in the room, he had to be the smartest. And if he could not make men respect him, he would make them fear him so deeply that they would carry him on their shields into battle, treating him like a living god of war. The Boneless nickname was not an insult. By the time he was done with England, it was a title of horror. To understand the monster, you must first understand the pack he ran with. Ivar did not grow up in isolation. He was raised in the shadow of giants. His father was the most famous raider in Christendom, and his brothers were swiftly becoming legends in their own right. You have likely heard their names. There was Bjorn Ironside, a man whose skin was said to be impenetrable in battle, a physical juggernaut who would go on to raid the Mediterranean. There was Ubba, a hulking berserker who preferred the axe to conversation, and there were Hvitserk and Sigurd Snake in the Eye. These were Ragnar Lothbrok's sons, a fraternity of alpha predators born and bred for one purpose: war. In any other family, in any other time, The disabled brother would have been the object of pity. He would have been the one left behind to tend the hearth while the men went Viking. But the sagas paint a very different, very disturbing picture of the dynamic between these brothers. They didn't pity Ivar, they deferred to him. This is the most fascinating psychological puzzle of the Viking Age. Why would Bjorn Ironside, a man who could likely crush a horse's skull with his bare hands, listen to the commands of a younger brother who had to be carried on a stretcher? The answer lies in the specific nature of Viking leadership. The Norsemen valued strength, yes, but they idolized wit. They called it slayed, cunning, craftiness, the ability to see the trap before it springs. Ivar possessed a mind that was as sharp and cold as the North Sea. While his brothers were learning to swing swords, Ivar was studying the board game Hnefatafl, Viking chess. He was learning how to manipulate pieces, how to sacrifice pawns to capture kings. He realized early on that his brothers were potent weapons, but weapons need a hand to wield them. He became that hand. He positioned himself as the strategist of the family. If Bjorn was the muscle, Ivar was the brain. It was a symbiotic relationship born of necessity, but it was forged in cruelty. Historical texts suggest that Ivar compensated for his physical immobility with a terrifying upper body strength and a proficiency with the bow, one of the few weapons that did not require footwork. But his true weapon was his voice. He developed a tongue that could incite a berserker rage or talk a merchant out of his entire fortune. He learned that if he could not force men to obey him physically, he could manipulate them psychologically. He became a master of gaslighting and intimidation before those terms even existed. There is a chilling theory among modern historians regarding his condition. If Ivar truly suffered from a severe form of brittle bone disease, his life would have been a cycle of excruciating pain. Every day was a battle against his own skeleton. Chronic pain changes a person. It can strip away empathy. It can make you resent the healthy, the walking, the comfortable. It is entirely possible that Ivar's legendary cruelty, his appetite for torture and elaborate executions, was a projection of his own internal agony. He wanted the world to feel what he felt. He wanted to externalize his suffering. As the brothers grew into men, their raiding parties began to terrorize the coasts of France and Ireland. But these were just practice runs. They were merely sharpening their claws. The true turning point of Ivar's life, and the moment that would doom the Anglo-Saxon world, arrived with a piece of news from across the sea. It was the news of their father's death. But it wasn't just that Ragnar had died, it was how he had died. The legend says that Ragnar Lothbrok was captured by King Ehlers of Northumbria. Ehlers, a pious Christian king who saw Ragnar not as a warrior but as a pagan devil, decided to execute him in a manner that would humiliate him. He threw the great Viking hero into a pit of venomous snakes. As the vipers bit into his flesh, Ragnar is said to have shouted a final, defiant prophecy. How the little piglets would grunt if they knew how the old boar suffered. When this news reached the sons of Ragnar, the reaction was explosive. The sagas describe Bjorn gripping his spear so tightly that the wood left an impression in his hand. Hvitserk was trimming his fingernails and cut right to the bone without flinching. But Ivar's reaction was different. He did not rage, he did not scream, he went quiet. While his brothers wanted to launch an immediate disorganized raid to burn a few villages in revenge, Ivar saw the bigger picture. He saw an opportunity. He told them to wait, to not just gather a crew, but to gather an army, a great heathen army. He argued that the death of Ragnar Lothbrok was not a tragedy. It was a casus belli, a justification for total war. He didn't just want to kill King Ehlers. He wanted to dismantle the entire kingdom of Northumbria. This was the moment Ivar the Boneless truly took command. He transformed from a raider into a general. He began sending out messengers to every harbour in Scandinavia, from Denmark to Norway to the Swedish coast. He promised glory, he promised silver, but mostly he promised land. He was organising the largest invasion force Britain had ever seen, and he was doing it from a sitting position. The piglets were not just grunting, they were sharpening their tusks, and the boar's death would be paid for in a river of royal blood. The year is 865 AD. To the Anglo-Saxon monks scribbling in their candlelit scriptoriums, it must have felt like the apocalypse had arrived. For decades, the Vikings had been a seasonal nuisance. Terrifying, yes, but predictable. They came in the summer, raided a monastery, burned a village, and vanished back into the mist before the autumn storms. They were like a bad weather system. You endured it, and then you rebuilt. But in 865, the weather changed. The storm didn't leave. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, the primary historical record of the time, shifts its tone in this year. It stops recording isolated raids and records the arrival of a force it simply calls the Michel Heathen here, the Great Heathen Army. This was not a raiding party of 3 ships. This was a coalition of hundreds of longships, carrying thousands of warriors. It was a floating city of leather, wood, and iron, and at its helm sat the cripple, Ivar the Boneless. This is where Ivar's genius truly begins to shine, separating him from the brutish stereotype of a Viking warlord. If he were merely a savage, he would have sailed directly to Northumbria to attack King Aella immediately. He would have let emotion dictate his strategy. But Ivar was cold. He knew that an army of this size, estimated between 3,000 to 5,000 men, had a fatal weakness: logistics. They needed food, they needed a base, and most importantly, they needed mobility. So Ivar did not land in Northumbria. He landed further south, in the kingdom of East Anglia. Imagine the terror of the East Anglian king, Edmund, when he saw the horizon turn black with sails. But Ivar didn't attack. He sent envoys. He made a demand that was unprecedented in Viking warfare. He didn't just want gold, he wanted horses. This was a masterstroke. Vikings were sailors, infantrymen. They were not cavalry. But Ivar understood that in England, to conquer the land, you had to move faster than the news of your arrival. He bullied East Anglia into supplying his army with mounts as the price for peace. King Edmund, thinking he was buying safety for his people, gave Ivar exactly what he needed to destroy his neighbours. It was a deal with the devil. Ivar wintered in East Anglia, feeding his army on English grain, resting his men and training them to ride. He was weaponizing one English kingdom against another. While he waited, Ivar's spies were busy. This is another detail often overlooked. The Vikings had excellent intelligence networks. Ivar knew that Northumbria, the target of his vengeance, was in the middle of a civil war. The usurper King Aella, the man who killed Ragnar, was fighting the deposed King Osbert. The kingdom was divided. The timing was perfect. In late 866, Ivar gave the order. The Great Heathen Army broke camp. They didn't sail, they rode. A column of thousands of mounted Vikings thundered north, bypassing defences, moving with a speed that the English had never seen before. They weren't heading for a village. They were heading for the jewel of the north, the city of York. York, or Euphoric to the Saxons, was the ancient Roman capital of the north. It was protected by crumbling but still formidable Roman walls. Capturing it would send a message that the Vikings were here to stay. Ivar timed the attack with a cynical precision. He arrived on November 1st, All Saints' Day. The city leaders were in the cathedral. The guards were likely feasting or resting. The city was distracted by holiness when hell arrived at the gates. The Vikings stormed York with barely a fight. They slaughtered the garrison, seized the treasury, and occupied the Roman fortifications. Suddenly, the Northumbrians woke up to a nightmare. Their capital was gone. The civil war between Aella and Osbert suddenly seemed petty. Faced with extinction, the two rival kings did the only thing they could. They united. They pooled their remaining forces and marched on York to dislodge the invaders. This was the moment Ivar had been waiting for. He didn't just want the city, he wanted the kings. He allowed them to approach. He allowed them to think they had a chance. He used the Roman walls not just for defence, but as a trap. The ensuing battle for York was a catastrophe for the English. The sagas describe a brutal, close-quarters slaughter in the streets. The Vikings, fighting with their backs to the walls they now owned, decimated the Northumbrian relief force. In the chaos, King Osbert was cut down. But for King Aelle, the man who threw Ragnar into the snake pit, a darker fate was reserved. The battle ended, the smoke cleared, and Ivar the Boneless looked down from his stretcher at the man who had murdered his father. The conquest was secured. Now, the theatre of cruelty could begin. The history books tell us the battle was won, but the sagas tell us that for King Aelle, the true horror was just starting. History is often written by the victors, but in the case of the Viking Age, it was written by the victims, and there is no chapter in their history more terrifying or more debated than what happened next to King Aiel. The capture of Aiel was not a normal prisoner of war situation. For Ivar, this was a ritualistic necessity. The sagas tell us that upon capturing the king, Ivar ordered the preparation of the blodorn, the blood eagle. If you're squeamish, you might want to look away from your imagination for a moment, because if the accounts are true, this was one of the most anatomically creative forms of torture ever devised by human cruelty. The ritual allegedly went like this. Aiel was restrained face down. An eagle with outstretched wings was carved into his back with a blade. But that was just the drawing. The executioner, some sources say it was Ivar himself, then hacked through the ribs near the spine, severing them one by one. The ribs were then physically bent outwards, cracked open like a pair of gruesome wings. Finally, the executioner would reach into the open cavity and pull the victim's lungs out through the wounds, draping them over the broken ribs. As the dying man gasped for his final breaths, the lungs would flutter, mimicking the movement of a bird's wings. To add final insult to injury, salt was rubbed into the gaping wound.